But really, once you start going, what we see from our clients, and the bulk of them are small and mid-sized businesses. They have somewhere between 5 and 100 employees.
Okay.
And one of the things that we see are just a lack of consistency with the contracts they're using. Their contract terms are cobbled together here and there from different sources. Sometimes it's trial and error. They've got what they currently use because they've weeded out everything that didn't work in the past.
Right.
Those are expensive lessons to learn.
Welcome back, everyone, to another Keys to the Commonwealth podcast. Landry Fields here. I'm excited for another conversation today with another business entrepreneur and leader here in the Central Kentucky area. So without further ado, we've got a lot of interesting conversations we're going to have today about some very unique topics, especially for business owners that a lot of them probably don't think about or think about when it's too late, maybe necessarily. So without further ado, I'll introduce Matthew Lockaby to the Keys to the Commonwealth podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you are obviously more in the legal space as far as that goes with Lockaby Law and practice here in town, and he can expand that more on that. But before we do, as far as and how that's going to relate to a lot of entrepreneurs, business owners, and so forth, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Jump in the DeLorean, and how do you get to where you are today?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. This is really exciting. I've been looking forward to this. I've practiced law for almost 19 years now.
Yeah.
And there's the constant through line has been labor and employment work.
Right.
I've done handled a few other areas during the course of my career, but labor, employment, and work for employers and management has always been kind of the lion's share of what I do. So spent 10 years at a big firm and launched Lockaby PLLC in March of 2016. Mm-hmm. And we have since then worked with employees, employers, and management in just about every aspect of workplace law.
Yeah.
And so that has led in 2023, I launched an HR consulting company, Access HR Solutions, mm-hmm. which is a natural outgrowth of the firm's labor and employment practice. Those two disciplines are pretty closely aligned and intertwined. So,
it makes logical sense in that sense with what you do on a daily basis, and maybe sometimes where the CPAs do more financial, sometimes you see that merging of like CPAs and financial advising sometimes married together because it makes sense for larger scenarios or larger corporation scenarios. So that makes sense obviously for that. So where'd you grow up? Where are you from originally and so forth like that though?
Grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Yep.
My family is all in Cincinnati. I feel like an adopted son because I went to Center. Okay. And graduated from Center College, graduated from Chase College of Law at NKU. And we were, most of my dad's side of the family, we call ourselves members of the Ohio Navy. We would come down with our boats every summer to Lake Cumberland. And my family has property down in Russell County on Lake Cumberland, and I've spent most of my life in Kentucky, as it feels like.
Well, I mean, houseboat capital of the world, I think, from what I understand.
Yeah.
Even though some of my best carriers don't sell boat insurance, which I don't adhere, which doesn't make any sense to me. That's a separate conversation and complaint. But that being said, we've sat down and we're kind of talking a lot more about just the aspect of how, obviously, this podcast is dedicated to property investors as well as business owners and different facets. Obviously, my practice with Nova Insurance, we deal a lot with franchises, commercial property owners, people with numerous employees of usually 20 or more. And in that sense, there's a lot of aspect of those things where people have questions or business owners, again, maybe they don't ask the questions up front like they should. So let's dive into that a little bit just from the legal aspect first of what you see most often that I think business owners are missing, or where you're able to help and bring in the most value to them, either on a startup or acquisition, mergers. There's all kinds of aspects we can go into there.
Yeah, I guess from a startup perspective, there is this corporate side of things, right? Making sure you're selecting the right entity that gives you the most flexibility and gives you the best tax advantages for whatever service or product you're providing. There's the process of going through your operating agreement or shareholder agreement if you have partners, and figuring out how that division of labor and capital contributions and how the day-to-day governance is going to work. But really, once you start going, what we see from our clients, and the bulk of them are small and mid-sized businesses. They have somewhere between 5 and 100 employees.
Okay.
And one of the things that we see are just a lack of consistency with the contracts they're using. Their contract terms are cobbled together here and there from different sources. Sometimes it's trial and error. They've got what they currently use because they've weeded out everything that didn't work in the past.
Right.
Those are expensive lessons to learn.
My brother-in-law's friend had some kind of operating agreement, and they used that, and it turns out it was, it was like something filed in a different state, so it didn't even translate correctly to the state laws here. I'm sure you've seen all kinds of different things like that.
Absolutely. But there's no judgment. It's all completely understandable, right? It's an expensive process. It's time consuming, and you're starting a business, and business owners have 20 different things they've got to do every day, and it needed to be done yesterday. Yep. And so taking the time to spend 30 days working with a lawyer requires so much more advanced thought and effort that they might not have known they needed or anticipated they needed until it was too late. But
especially those business owners that are going to have employees, probably more so. You've got the typical, I've got an LLC, I'm buying some real estate. That's usually a little bit more cut and dry, I would assume. I guess maybe I'm incorrectly assuming there. But you get into businesses like yours, mine, storefront businesses where you have employees and multiple investors of different kinds, it changes that dynamic a lot, obviously, of what you're going to be experiencing, where somebody can hit you from a liability standpoint of any kind, different aspects within if there's somebody that wants to poke holes into it and you haven't done your due diligence, obviously like with yourself, then they're going to find a way to poke a hole in it, type of thing.
Absolutely. I think whenever you add people to the mix, there's going to be issues, and obviously the more people you add, the more statutory protections become available to them, either on the state or federal level. Which leads us to this other issue that we see all the time, and it's, again, completely understandable in the sense that most businesses with fewer than 100 employees don't have an experienced and knowledgeable HR person or team on staff. And a lot of times, most businesses just get away with this while they're young and growing or even scaling because the owner is so present in the business and the culture the owner wanted is there. At least they think it is. But the relationships owners have and management has when it's a small company are different than the relationships they have when they hit 50, 75, 100 employees or more. Yeah. You just don't have the same relationship with your first employee as you do with your 100.
For sure.
And the strategic side of HR in helping the business keep the culture that they want or build the culture that they want, helping them retain the people and the talent they have, helping them source and find the talent that they need. This aspect of HR, separate and apart from just day-to-day compliance and record keeping and those administrative tasks that everyone views as rather mundane but are critically important in a lot of respects. That's the other piece, and I say it's understandable because HR generally will be the most expensive position on staff for some of these businesses.
Okay. I don't think I realized that. Probably in some similar instances with me and a lot of businesses, people don't realize that your biggest insurance aspect when you're talking about businesses like we are with employees is workers' comp insurance is going to be your probably biggest, unless you're in trucking or something like that.
Sure.
But generally speaking, workers' comp is going to be your biggest expense aspect. So and I guess all that to say is employees are going to be your biggest expense one way or another type of scenario. But obviously we need employees to grow. And like you're saying, when you're small and you're more in it and having your hat on, wearing many different hats as a business owner, you can get away with a lot more. But then obviously in order to scale, and the idea of scaling is what I think most business owners want to do, because that means you have to now take off those hats and put those hats onto some other people, more qualified people, which a lot of times can be a good thing because there's probably less things falling through the cracks at the end of the day, or they have more expertise maybe in that area than you truly do. Like you know enough to be dangerous, but you don't know everything like you should maybe in that particular role or hat.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And I think there are a lot of business owners that struggle with that. They're going from an owner-operator role to a delegating and leading and setting a vision and setting a culture role and finding people to take the helm on each of those discrete initiatives. But yeah, I mean, you think about it, a lot of service-based businesses, their largest expense is going to be their payroll expense and insurance for companies that sell more goods or products. And payroll is still going to be a huge expense as they begin to scale.
Yeah.
And managing that expense is tough. And adding someone that's 30 or 40 or 50% higher in salary for someone who's really good with really good experience who can help in this HR function. Again, not just from a compliance standpoint,
sure,
but from a strategic C-suite type of advice and counsel. It's no wonder that it's commonly the last, executive position that's filled.
And so for those that might be listening or watching in that sense, with the access aspect of things, define and distinguish the differences between, say, an ADP or something like that versus what you all do, or maybe they're similar but more localized and more personal. You can explain that better than I could. Maybe just distinguish between those two type of scenarios for what that means. And in essence, we're talking probably fractional HR aspect, where you maybe don't have a truly HR designated team or multiple team members, but you're able to fill some of those spots from am I correct in that?
You're spot on.
Yeah.
And that's actually one of the first questions we get when we tell people, hey, we have this HR consulting company, here's what we can do.
Yeah.
Irrespective of what we say, their first question is, do you do payroll? And our answer is always no.
Right. And that's what I thought. I just want to make sure everyone was like crystal clear on that too here.
Yeah. So but it raises an important distinction, because administering your payroll and actually processing your payroll are two different things. So ADP, Paychex, companies like that. There's a really great local company called Payroll Solutions.
Correct.
They're processing your payroll. They're withholding the taxes. They're sending those taxes off to the local governments or state and federal government, and otherwise handling all of your reporting requirements.
Right.
So Axis, though, is a fractional HR service provider.
Yeah.
We can, for smaller businesses, we can become or be at your de facto HR department. We can fulfill that entire function. So everything from helping you hire candidates, put out job postings, interview folks, onboard them, on the job training. We can do day-to-day record keeping. But we can also, in addition to that, what we call more tactical work, we can work with your executives, with the owner, and we can come up with strategies for what this business looks like in the next 6, 12, 18 months, whatever it may be. So we can assess your compensation strategy. Are your wages and benefits competitive in the marketplace? Is that going to allow you to recruit the best talent?
Yeah.
So what does that talent acquisition strategy look like? Where you're looking? How are you sourcing your next great employee? But otherwise, looking at how your organization is set up from top to bottom. Who's delegating? How are they doing it? So one of the things that one of the biggest misconceptions out there is how you evaluate a company's culture. And a lot of people think it's, well, did they bring in cupcakes on the birthday? Was there a summer party or a picnic or something like that? And all those things are great, right? There's something to the camaraderie you build during those events. But culture, the way we look at it, is how does work get done from the moment it's being sold or marketed to the time it comes in the door, through the workflow, and then how it eventually gets completed.
So you're looking at it more from a processes standpoint.
Absolutely.
Than maybe me as the business owner being like, oh, we do these quarterly outings or things of that nature that I think we usually associate with that from that standpoint.
And so we're evaluating how the work is getting done, and there is this aspect of HR and operations working hand in hand. Because there are places that have a very horizontal structure where there's a lot of folks who are, I guess, on an even on an even basis with their peers, and there's not a lot of room for delegation. And then other places are very hierarchical, right? You can't do anything without getting 3 approvals from different people in different departments. So, but what that means from a people perspective and what that means for your employee experience is really important.
Yeah.
And you know, some people, if you went to work at, say, P&G, you know it's going to be a very hierarchical experience. You're going to have to run through a lot of red tape.
Yeah.
A startup obviously would be the exact opposite. You might not know what to do because you have no idea who can approve anything or if you have the money to do it. But setting up from an executive level what that people experience, what that employee experience looks like, and how the work is getting done is really, really important.
Yeah.
I think a lot of owners do worry about, but obviously you have to scale to a certain point before that becomes a real pressing need.
And to that point, we were talking earlier about talent off air in that sense, and I wanted to dive into that aspect because I think me and you both see it. I mean, the world is definitely changing. We've heard these terms like silver tsunami out here before, the idea that there's a lot of business owners that have been around for 30, 40, 50 years that are now trying to figure out what is my plan to retire or to sell the business. Like what does that look like? And many people don't have a plan at this point type of scenario. Or my son or daughter, they're not interested in necessarily taking over the family business. So what do I do in that sense? And so the idea that there's a lot of businesses that are going to be coming on the market or are coming on the market. And I think the stats are pretty strong, pretty high in the sense of like how many of those go unsold each year in that sense. So from a merger and acquisitions side of things, before we talk about necessarily the talent aspect, I think what was the stat we were talking about earlier as far as the number starting a business from scratch versus acquiring or merging with an existing business type of scenario. And when you start looking at it from that angle, a lot more makes sense in that as far as an opportunity, I think, for the future here.
Absolutely. So we've been hearing about the silver tsunami for a while now. Just the number of baby boomers who are business owners, small, mid-sized businesses, and they don't a rather large percentage of them. I've heard 75%. I don't know how accurate that is, but it's high. It's more than 10%, right? Don't have a plan for their retirement, or they don't have an exit strategy. So it does present a tremendous number of opportunities for young entrepreneurs who are looking to own their own business, to run their own business. But the benefit to this is that the statistics are staggering. I think, as you referenced, less than 10% of startups succeed. Right, more than
first year,
90% of startups fail in the first 12 to 18 months.
I think this stat is still even 80% the first 5 years or something. Like, I don't think it gets that much better. I think that 5-year mark, of which I've surpassed a little bit ago, I was very relieved to have hit that. Right. Be like, oh, well, congratulations! Wow, cool. I guess I didn't realize that. I hadn't even heard that until after. But
yeah, well, and the statistics are even more startling because businesses that are backed by venture capital, and we're talking businesses with 20, 30, 40 million in seed capital, 75% of them are failing within 2 years. Right. So, but if you look at the opposite end of the spectrum, what is the failure rate of businesses that are acquired? And it's less than 10% in the first 2 years. So the statistics are actually flipped. It is a safer investment to acquire a small business where you have customers, you have a tech stack, you have a marketing strategy, you have roughly a business plan. You are able to skip all of the headaches and entrepreneur experiences during the startup phase. Yeah, and now I think it's important for a buyer to have, a thesis or an investment thesis for what they want to do with the company, what value they think they can add to the company. But to your point, there are a tremendous number of opportunities for purchase or acquisition of small businesses from owners who at this time have no plan for what it looks like, what their lives look like in the next few years.
And a lot of times, no offense to those owners who have run those businesses fairly successfully for, decades on decades, but a lot of times there's a lot of ways of improving upon the business that they've started with more of a fresh mindset, with more of a fresh idea of like the technology or ways you can do things out there that might be able to grow the business beyond what it was, with the same number of people potentially, or a little less people. And that can be very, like people when they buy a house, they're very connected emotionally to a house. Same goes for business owners. If you're selling your startup business that you've created from scratch, I know there's a lot that goes into it. And a lot of times there's your employees, and I'm looking out and I've got employees right here, and you're like, the idea of leaving them in the hands of somebody that's qualified would weigh on me a lot as well, type of scenario, and making sure that that's done in a great way. So a lot of times I think there can be wiggle room too. There could be scenarios where they just don't like the fit, but I think a lot of times is they've just not thought about it. They don't know how to market it. They don't know what to do, whether, speaking with a law firm, speaking with people who broker businesses, and what they can do to set themselves up in order to do so, and do it in a way that they still feel comfortable with at the end of the day.
You're absolutely right. I think that is the single biggest issue that we've run into is the business owners don't know where to start. But what happens is they start too late. Yes. So, everyone wants to be involved earlier in the process, as early as possible. But I think there were 3 steps. Well, first step is absolutely critical, but it involves 3 different people. I think it involves your financial advisor. I think it involves a lawyer, who specifically one that handles small business mergers and acquisitions. Yeah. The transaction costs, like Matt Lockaby,
yeah,
Lockaby
right.
PLLC. But if your business does $1 million in revenue a year, and you've steadily made a good profit and have earned a good living and have built this thing from scratch with your own sweat equity over the years, you don't need a lawyer who just worked on the last Microsoft acquisition, right? You don't. There's so many parts of this process that aren't necessary, but nevertheless, speaking to your financial advisor, speaking to a lawyer, and then speaking to a broker, I think can be really, really beneficial.
Yeah.
The broker can help you get a real sense of what the value of the business is, can set expectations for what the sale process looks like,
or set expectations for what that's actually worth as well, because I know business owners would probably have an idea in their head, and usually that is not correct.
It is. Speaking from experience, Axis has gone down this path, and we've spoken to a number of targets that we are looking at acquiring as we continue our inorganic growth.
Sure.
And, we've talked to owners who just psychologically weren't ready to sell.
Yeah.
They were very much aware that they were getting to an age where they needed to and needed to figure out what they wanted to do, but psychologically, this was their baby. This is the thing they've built. This was their identity.
Expand upon that too, because a lot of times, one day you could be like, "Oh, I'm selling the business," and then you sleep on it, and the next day you're like, "Nope, I'm not selling the business." And it's it's such a back and forth scenario with a lot of business owners that build it up from scratch type of scenario, even more so. But then there's sometimes where maybe they haven't been thinking about it, and then just something's clicked, and they're like, "You know what? I'm done. I want to cash in on everything I've worked my butt off for decades and decades." So there's this. It's all over the map, I'm sure, and you see it all firsthand.
It is. Well, and there are days where I feel like more of a therapist or a counselor than their lawyer or their HR consultant who's helping them, get HR ready for due diligence, because when you go through the sale process, you're taking on a second full-time job.
Yeah.
Now it's episodic. There are peaks and valleys in the amount of the commitment, but it is a massive undertaking, and there are lots of moving parts. And not one of the transactions has gone smoothly. There's always a hiccup at every step of the way, but if you can anticipate those, and if you can see where the hiccups are going to be, what you think buyers are really going to get hung up on, you can start to be proactive in how you plan and how you present the information.
Yeah.
Things like that. So I feel like I missed my calling. Should I have just gone to New York and been an M&A lawyer 20 years ago? It's one of the most fascinating parts of what we do, and it's just something I love doing. And as a small business owner, I also feel like I'm providing exceptional value to these people who are doing the same thing or who have done the same thing that I am striving to do with both Axis and my firm.
100%.
So I'm learning as much as from them and how they're running their business as they are from me about the legal side of things and how deal structures get sorted out.
Switching topics here a little bit on what, you have acquired a business or started up a business type of scenario. So you're more on the front end of everything, and you obviously have talked through legal aspects and so forth. But coming back to the employee topic aspect, we were there's a couple changes I want to talk about that I know you're involved with, but the idea of retaining talent is a big one in that sense of what you can do back to your culture at your agency, make sure you're paying them well, and so in all those regards. But there's been some recent changes, obviously, with the FTC about the idea of where you are allowed to practice at businesses. So let's talk about that a little bit. So there's been some questions of what that actually means, what that doesn't mean, and so forth. So go for it.
Yeah, there are a lot of misconceptions around what non-competes are and how they work and when they're enforceable or not. In Kentucky and in most states, non-compete agreements, which are simply agreements saying that the employee is restricted from working for competitors within an industry for a certain amount of time after the employment ends.
Or sometimes the radius, I guess, is sometimes thrown in there too, right?
Correct. So in Kentucky, here they are generally enforceable, but the business owner, the employer has to establish that the terms of the restriction itself, in terms of the geographic scope, which is the radius you were talking about, the duration, the amount of time of the restriction, and then the character of the restriction itself are reasonable. So that's what we refer to as just the contract analysis, right? As a contract matter, are these terms reasonable for this restriction for this employee? But there's a separate analysis, which is this antitrust analysis, which is what is the legitimate business interest the employer has in restricting this employee's mobility to go work even for a competitor?
Yeah.
And so Kentucky law is pretty clear that the purpose of a non-compete is to prevent unfair competition, not to prevent fair competition. And I know that there are employers out there who would love to prevent all competition if they could, but there's obviously federal statutes that don't allow that. Yeah. And I think that sometimes this is the more complicated analysis. So, and one of the things that we see over and over again, and as a perfect example, and one I think that's easy for most business owners to understand, we were involved in a case years ago where our client had hired national sales managers from another company.
Okay.
And these were higher ranking sales figures within their sales team. But the company that they went to, our client, sold products, the exact same products as they were selling for their former employer. They sold through a distributor. They sold direct to consumer,
Okay.
Their former employers sold through a distributor model. So there are different marketing strategies. You have different customers.
Different customers entirely.
The supply chain's not all that different, but the way that they do business, who they're targeting and how they go about doing it is completely different. So yes, they're working in the same industry. Yes, they're working for a competitor, but they weren't actually competing with their former employer.
Right.
So, so this is what we talk about when we talk about a contract analysis and an antitrust analysis. Their non-competes could have said you can't work for a competitor within 100 miles for 2 years. Fair enough. That's reasonable enough in most instances.
Right.
But is there actual competition occurring? And what's the legitimate interest in preventing them from working somewhere else when they're not really competing with them?
But that was kind of more or less the old way, right? But the laws now, you know better than I. Is it changed officially, or is it starting to change, or in some aspects as far as the non-compete aspect? I mean, 'cause non-solicit is different aspect of it, type
Absolutely.
of scenario. And so I think people have thought like, oh, you can, they've done away with that. And, non-solicit, if somebody was to leave and you basically pull the rug out from underneath your whole business and take all of your clients, that I can understand a non-compete in solicitation aspects, but a non-compete of not allowing someone to do the job that they are able to do, licensed to do, et cetera, does seem a little, I don't know, non-ethical sometimes, depending on how you think about it, type of scenario of like not being able to do the job I I do type of scenario?
I think you're right. There's and I'll cover a lot here, I guess.
Okay.
So yeah, a non-solicit is different from a non-compete. The non-compete prevents you from working for, say, a competitor.
Yeah.
Or
normally those are together, same kind of like legal document most of the time, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And so a non-solicitation, though, won't prevent you from working anywhere in particular, but it will prevent an employee from going back and luring or soliciting or recruiting either former customers, former clients that they had access to or had learned a lot of information about. And non-solicits can also apply to the workforce, right? You won't go back and lure all the best employees away to the new employer. So what is changing? I think there's a couple of things. One, there is a trend, I think, nationally where non-competes are increasingly coming under scrutiny. It's just an unfair practice. So there are 4 states that have banned nearly all non-competes. Okay. There are a number of states that have placed some kind of restriction. Maybe you can't have a non-compete in certain industries, like in the healthcare industry, for instance. Or you can't have a duration that exceeds 1 year or 2 years or something like that. But otherwise, the biggest news of recently has been the Federal Trade Commission. So in 2024, January of this year, the FTC issued a rule that banned most non-competes. I say most because non-competes, as they are included within, say, the purchase and sale agreement or an asset purchase agreement in the sale of a business, are still permitted.
Which makes sense.
Which makes
totally
sense.
logical sense.
You're buying goodwill, you're buying customers, you can't pay this owner a bunch of money and then have them go start up another company the next day. But there's also some pretty critical distinctions, right? In the employer-employee context, most often than not, absent the relationship with senior executives, most employees are given a non-compete and told to sign, and they don't get the job if they don't sign. Right. So there's not an equal bargaining power. But in an M&A transaction, both sides have attorneys. This is an agreement that's a part of the deal. Yeah. So there's an arm's length negotiation and a much different set of circumstances, right? But no, the FTC banned most non-competes. And the idea, I think what the FTC has said is that there has been an abuse of this restraint of trade over time, and it has slowly infected low-wage, middle-wage workers. Non-competes going forward, assuming the rule holds up, would be illegal even for senior executives. But the FTC is very clearly concerned with the non-competes and their practice of limiting worker mobility. Yeah, it's suppressing wages. It's keeping down working conditions. It's doing a lot. There's a lot of externalities.
Yeah, and like you had mentioned prior to me that I don't think people are, including myself, realize how many industries you would never think have non-competes do in that sense. Like from the mobility aspect, where you said you had a security company, maybe like there are guys working at a mall as a security officer. He's not a licensed police officer of that sort, but he's there. But yet he's got a non-compete, and he can't go. Maybe he's being paid $15 an hour, but he's not able to go to another job or take that's nearby that's now offering him $17, $18 an hour type of scenario. And that's what we're talking about as far as mobility aspect, or sometimes stifling really the free market aspect of things. And so I think that was kind of a shock to me when you mentioned how because maybe a lot of people like myself are always kind of like thinking like, oh, the law, not law, obviously, but you took care of that yourself with the law. But like, insurance, or maybe sometimes a realtor, or sometimes CPAs or something like that. We're usually thinking those mindsets type of scenario, financial advising maybe type of thing. But there's a lot more, I think, than we realize is what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't remember the number specifically, but I think it was something on the order of 30 to 40 million Americans are subject to a non-compete agreement, which is staggering.
30 to 40 million?
30 to 40 million. And we're talking about everyone from doctors down to minimum wage third shift security guards. Yeah. Right? And it's every industry. It's healthcare, insurance, the financial world, banking, everything. It's not just the service-based businesses. It's also businesses that sell goods and products. It is everything. Engineering, architects. Yeah. We've seen them in at least 24 different industries. So yeah, it's as you mentioned, lawyers have exempted themselves from non-competes. They're not permitted for lawyers, at least in Kentucky and in most other states. So I think sometimes as lawyers, we kind of lose sight of what the impact of these agreements is, right? Mm-hmm. The FTC found that thousands and thousands of new businesses would get started were it not for non-competes, that there would be billions of increased wages over the next decade if non-competes are at least eradicated in the way that they've proposed. And working conditions would improve, wages would improve, benefits would improve, because businesses are going to have to do more to remain competitive within the marketplace for the best talent. Yeah, which is a tricky thing.
So with this ruling, is that already in effect then? I guess I didn't know if there was a timing scenario, when things are immediately affected as far as your current contracts are people having to re-sign and redo their non-compete or non-solicitation type of agreements these days? Like, as a business owner, what do I need to be doing if that was the case?
Well, there needs to be some prep work right now. The final rule was issued in April 23rd, I believe. Okay. It takes effect on September 4th. Got it. However, there are a number of cases that have been filed in federal courts around the country challenging the rule. So last Wednesday, just before our July 4th holiday, a federal court in Texas granted a limited injunction, effectively staying implementation of the rule, at least for the plaintiffs in that case. So a hearing on the merits a decision on the merits, I'm told, will be rendered by the end of August. So what does all that mean? Yeah. A federal court in Texas has said the non-compete rule does not apply to the parties in that case, effectively meaning the FTC will not be able to enforce the rule with respect to those parties.
Kind of like NIL athletes not getting paid in reverse. No,
so it's
interesting timing, though, with the idea of free trade with NIL at the same time with this aspect. And like you said, but finish that statement as far as what that means as far as when do things change.
Yeah. Sorry. So there's a dueling case, if you will, in federal court in Pennsylvania, where most watchers are expecting the court to uphold the rule and allow it to be implemented and take effect on September 4th. Okay. And so there will be appeals from each of those decisions, and lawyers, I think, generally in this space are expecting this matter to get to the Supreme Court fairly quickly. Okay. And the issue will be, does the FTC have the authority to issue this kind of rule on such a widespread basis? I think there's some good arguments why the FTC does have that authority. I think there's some equally good arguments on why the FTC doesn't have this authority.
There's always two sides to the story. I get that.
And it's my job. I have to look at both sides. But yeah, what can employers be doing right now? Well, if the rule takes effect, most existing non-compete agreements will be invalidated and unenforceable. Okay. Employers will have an obligation to tell their employees this non-compete covenant that you previously signed is no longer enforceable, and we're not going to enforce it. There are some exceptions to that. There are non-competes that are currently in place, and a claim has already accrued with respect to that. So maybe there's already been a breach of that non-compete. Sure. Those wouldn't be affected, and the existing non-competes with senior executives wouldn't be affected. But for the most part, the vast majority of non-competes would be invalidated.
Gotcha. So, yeah, it's wild. I mean, like I said, especially just the timing of this, like I said, with NIL or other stuff like that, more of like a true general free market. If it hopefully allows people to create more businesses and more of that free trade. The timing aspect is what I'm getting at, is just the idea of where we are with technology or an AI and so forth like that, that I think the spirit of entrepreneurship will become that much greater the further we go, as more and more opportunities to basically work from home, work from anywhere, have your own business, people working from different places, AI taking over certain aspects of it, allowing you to grow a bigger business with fewer people, kind of like the internet did at one point in time. We're kind of in that world all over again, that spec. So it's like kind of interesting timing that is happening right now.
Right.
You gotta, probably good timing. Maybe like I said, there's always pros and cons to every argument in a lot of ways, but
well, there just seems to be a number of sea changes all at the same time.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I'm saying.
If this non-compete rule takes effect, it would be a significant change to the way businesses have done business for a long time.
And by a long time, we're talking like as long as like decades on decades, right?
Yeah, at least, if not a century.
Okay,
I mean,
that's what I was saying. I was like, I feel like this has been forever, practically.
Absolutely, we have cases from our Kentucky courts going back to the early 1900s on these types of matters. So
that's what it was a big deal when this started.
Not recent, yeah, absolutely. But with NIL work and this kind of more free market ability of student athletes to promote themselves and to make money off their own brand and name, image, and likeness. The advent of AI and what that means for every business, but in particular small businesses who have the ability to harness it.
Yeah.
I will make a plug for Axis. I'm not this shameless, but my partner Mike Newman, who has spent nearly 30 years in progressive HR leadership roles, is one of the few nationally certified AI specialists in terms of how AI and HR work together. Really? And how HR departments can use AI in a myriad aspects of the HR function. So from recruiting to talent acquisition to payroll, there's so many uses that for AI within the HR space that can make people's lives a lot easier. And knowing which AI to select, how to use it, how to make sure your use of the AI isn't violating state and federal laws, all can be really, really tricky. But having someone to help navigate you from selecting to implementation to testing to modifying can be valuable.
This whole time frame that we're in right now, it feels obviously a lot like the 90s again in that sense. And it always reminds me of the clip when I'm trying to discuss anything like that with people who have never really dived into it, or just, I get it, they're like, oh, that seems terrifying. We're like, well, it's happening. We got to talk about it at least. Right. But it always reminds me of the clip where it's like maybe the Today Show, one of those morning shows where they're talking about the internet. They're like, you remember this? And they're like, what is the internet, or like .com? Like, how do, they're like, what does that @ symbol like even mean, type of scenario? And you just look back at it now and you're like, these people sounded, they're smart people, but they sounded so dumb in the moment of just, in hindsight, looking after having already now fast forward in the future. And I'm sure there's going to be so many of these things as well down the too. But all that to say, what's the best way to kind of get a hold of you as far as that goes, or anything that they can, with Access, or obviously the law firm, and where business owners can find help here locally?
Yeah, so the law firm, we have a website. It's lockabylaw.com, LOCKABY law.com. There's our phone number and our contact information on the attorney bios, and we also have an online form you could submit if you want some information.
And we'll link that in the show notes here as well.
Wonderful. And Access, the same, accesshrky.com.
Okay.
You can read about my background, my partner Mike Newman's background, the services we offer, how we can help. And again, there's an online form if you'd like to reach out and connect. And I always have time. Coffee and donuts are one of my favorite things. So I'm always up for a coffee meeting to chat with an owner about what's going on and learning more about their business. And if there's a way we can help, would love to do it.
Well, appreciate the time and coming over for the episode today. And obviously, it's a lot to think about. And like I said, it's a conversation I think it needs to happen more often than it does.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you would agree with that.
There's no disagreement from me on that.
So we appreciate it. And we will see everybody back on next week's episode, or in a couple of weeks, with the next episode of the Keys to Commonwealth podcast. Thanks.